So I want to welcome you again. I'm going to be sharing my screen so I know what I'm talking to you about. I am Saul Carliner, and I'm going to be talking to you about a project today called The Building Blocks of Effective Teaching in Higher Education, Insights from the Empirical Literature. And there are more people listed here than are listed on the program. I've enlisted the entire project crew. It's a 3-year project, and the funding is been completed and the research been completed. It's the final preparation of the application resources that we're finalizing right now. I want to acknowledge everyone. I also want to let you know that instead of a panel, I've got such a booming voice. Apparently, I'm going to speak for everybody, but I don't want you to think this is my work by any stretch of the imagination. So to get started and to get all of you interacting, question for you. Approximately, you can respond to the chat. Approximately what percentage of faculty rate themselves as above average or better instructors? Again, approximately what percentage of faculty rate themselves as above average or better instructors? 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70? Okay, Jennifer says probably all. David's got 50. Somewhere near 75%. It's interesting. You all have the impression that faculty have a pretty high impression of themselves. And we're going to find out because that was one of the questions we asked. The next one is, of the following, what is the greatest challenge facing instructors? A, adding tech and media, this is pre-pandemic. I should preface this. Pre-pandemic. Being distracted and disengaged students, excessive focus on grades, institutional hurdles, overwhelming assessment, and unprepared students. Which one? Oh, we have the ones that are not on the list. We have B, we have one F, a few Fs, okay. And C, in your work, what is the most common concern that is raised to you by instructors? So I'm assuming most of you are not instructors, and I know, well, Nick is, but John isn't, and Yerong isn't, so I know a few aren't, but what's the number one concern that they tell you? So Georg says, is it George or Georg? No time. How do I deal with international students and the language proficiency? Correction load, yeah. Anything else? How to engage students fully asynchronously, good. Group size, absolutely. And these are issues, by the way, that come up in the literature. So what we're going to talk about today is, I don't have to worry about numbers in my face-to-face class. Why here? Interesting. Or I don't have to worry about XXX in my face-to-face classes. Why do I have to do that here? Interesting observation. So what I want to talk to you about today is a project that I've been working on for the past several years. I want to give you a little bit of background on the project, talk about our first phase of this, which was a needs assessment. What is it that is concerning faculty about their teaching? Give you examples of 2 of these summaries of the integrative literature reviews that we did. I will also talk about the methodology underlying that. And then I'll talk a little bit about one of the example of case studies. We have a group work one that I'm just going to talk to. And finally, I'll talk about one additional application that's arisen in the past year. This was originally proposed for last year, and something really wonderful has happened. We have an entirely new program that's going to be rooted in a lot of what we've learned in the research. So let me talk a little bit about the project. And if you have questions, feel free to chat them at me because I'm leaving the chat up so I can see if there's anybody has any questions. And I will be making some stops along the way to see if you have questions between one section and the next. So what's the origin of the project? Well, a colleague of mine at Marianopolis College, which is a CEGEP here in the Montreal area. And if you're not familiar with the CEGEP system, it's a unique feature to Quebec, and it includes the 12th grade of high school and the first year of university. So all of our universities at the undergraduate level primarily only teach years 2, 3, and 4. Year 1 is typically at the CEGEP level. And CEGEP is an acronym. It's a French acronym. And so it provides general educational preparation for a university. It also offers a number of vocational programs. So like X-ray techs, There's some nursing programs, other health-related occupations that are also offered through there, among others. So I was having a conversation with my colleague from Marianopolis, and they were looking to get more involved in research. At the time, I didn't have any funding, and so I was looking for something to research. So that was the conversation. But when we were looking together, my friend worked in faculty development, and I had been doing some work with faculty development in the years prior in a role. I was working part-time for the provost's office promoting e-learning. And one of the things that I discovered in that role, when I would work on workshops about integrating technology into the classroom, it didn't matter how often I was talking about the technology or what technology I was talking about or what aspect. So it could have been blended learning, it could have been live virtual training, it could have been anything to do with technology. But the issue that always seems to arise is that faculty come back to the same basic questions. They don't do their homework. If you're doing a flipped classroom, how can you be sure they're going to actually do the reading? What if they don't? If I have a lot of people talking in class, what happens if I lose control of my students? So you've got this stuff going on. And so what I found was even though we were trying to integrate all these advanced stuff, there were questions coming up as we were talking about this that are far more basic, and whether people want to admit them or not, they're not the sexiest topics because people, for a variety of reasons, it's a lot nicer to say we're focusing on innovation and education, and we're going to focus on integrating the latest technical achievements into our classrooms instead of we want to teach people how to just simply manage it. Facilitate a conversation and break up students into groups, because that's really basic stuff. But one of the things we learned is that's where the challenges are for people. So the goal was to come up with, well, what is their evidence-based material, or provide some evidence-based resources for professional development on these non-sexy, bread and butter, everyday issues. And in the process of doing that, maybe we could promote some collaboration between a CEGEP and a university. And finally, showcase any pedagogical innovations if we had some case studies that we could share, and the faculty were willing to do that. So that was the original impetus for this project. And from that, we developed the Concordia Marianopolis Faculty Development Collaboration, and it was a funded project from Entente Canada, Quebec, actually ran through 2020. And the core of it was something called a performance support system. And if you're not familiar with that, it's out of really the corporate side of instructional design. And the idea behind a performance support system is that it provides workers with all of the resources they need, the training, the information, in some cases, assistance with performing actual tasks in a work-related system in a way that's like natural to find in the context of the job. In addition, so that was the goal. To get there, we wanted to come up with a complete needs assessment. So if we were to develop such a system to assist faculty in their teaching, what would be in that system? What would we include? And then also create integrative literature reviews, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment, about these particular issues in teaching. An integrative literature review is a type of systematic review of the literature that allows people to, that pulls together all of the knowledge on a particular subject, all of the research, all of the other stuff. It depends how you define the body of knowledge that you're looking at. So this was the components of the original proposed system. And originally we were going to do a standalone system. We would have informative modules, each addressing a particular everyday ordinary teaching challenge that was identified by faculty in our needs assessment. And each module would synthesize the research on the subject, as well as provide specific guidance in particular disciplinary areas. And one of the reasons that was important was another observation that at least affected me, and it also came up in conversations with others, is that when faculty get advice, you don't find the English professor really interested in advice from the physics professor. And the physics professor doesn't necessarily seek advice from the education professor. And the education professor isn't going to listen to the advice from the architecture instructor. And so there's a certain not invented here syndrome that we have to deal with. So if we could provide specific advice inside the disciplines, in addition to some general advice, we thought it might have more credibility with instructors. And then ideally, on top of all that, we would provide summaries of individual studies if people want to go back to the original research without having to read the entire article. And finally, provide some related case studies that shows people applying these principles and these evidence-based principles in their actual teaching. But when you put something on a website or some kind of electronic resource, the problem is that it's out of sight and out of mind unless you constantly bring it into people's mind. So the idea was that we were going to provide some kind of additional resource to promote additional ongoing engagement. And so the idea would be the regular email messages that kind of promote a piece of the system over, and these would be sent out periodically over a period of time, and other ways of engaging people to discuss teaching. While we wanted to promote interaction on the one hand, we also recognize that certainly for university faculty, it's a second priority, the teaching. Their research is number one, so we didn't want it to be an odious requirement. And that was the components of the proposed system. And the informative modules is really where most of the effort was invested because that was the most complex to develop. So how do we do it? Well, as I mentioned, we start off with the needs assessment. Clearly, we're getting money, so other people agreed that we had the need, but we weren't able to do the needs assessment until we had the money. So there was a certain element where, there was a possibility we could find out that nobody wanted any help with their teaching. Unfortunately, that was not true. However, the quantitative study, we had a survey where we went to the faculty in the two institutions to ask them what challenges they face and get some demographic information about them. But we also did some focus groups, and I'll talk a little bit about both of them when I go through the needs assessment. Based on what they told us as their top needs, we would identify some particular discrete subject areas in which we would conduct further research and create an integrative literature review. And I'll explain what that is when we get to those. And then, because even though teaching is, especially those of us in this field, we believe it's a science, there's a scholarship of teaching and learning and related things. The real challenge is that despite all of that, because this is not necessarily the research agenda of the instructors who do the teaching, their researchers and their subject matter specialties, we wanted to make this material accessible to all of them, which meant we had to write it in really accessible language. And because it was being presented online where people tend to skim more than read, we also had to make sure it was an appropriate format for online and people would read it and be able to find what they were looking for. And so we prepared the application materials, but even though we feel like we understand our audience and we understand how to design things for the web, even the best intentions do not necessarily capture everything. And so we were going to conduct a usability test also to make sure that our proposed solution was something that would actually be useful to people. So we'll talk about the first major part of the study, the integrative literature reviews. And the integrative literature review is a type of systematic review of the literature, which means you're going through the body of literature on a particular subject, and you define what that subject is. And what you want to do is find everything in that body of literature that's relevant to your study. And there are different levels of systematic reviews. At the highest level is something called meta-analysis. And one of my colleagues, Bob Bernard, is a specialist in that. And what you do in meta-analysis is you only look for experimental studies. And you actually compare the effect sizes in all of those studies to see across all of these studies, what is the cumulative effect. So it's kind of like if you see these studies about online learning, and one of them will say, online learning is great, it's more effective than classroom. Others will say it's worse than classroom. Others will say it's about equal. When you put all of the studies together that do an experimental comparison, what is the effect? And there's a methodology for combining all those effect sizes and reaching a more broad conclusion. One level below that is metasynthesis that allows you to mix material from different kinds of methodology. So it does not have to be experimental. And a lot of the research in our field is not experimental. So it doesn't lend itself to meta-analysis. So you would look at things like qualitative studies, quasi-experimental research, survey research. You can put all that together. One notch below that is the integrative lit review. And what an integrative lit review, it broadens the scope of the literature. Now we can take ourselves out of just the study of a particular phenomenon. We can bring in theory research. We can even bring in gray market material, so studies performed by third parties, as well as material, if you want to include it, which we chose not to, you can also include material from the professional literature that's not been peer reviewed. You just have to identify it and clearly identify what you've got. And so for ours, what we did was we went and we identified keywords in the areas that we were looking at. We identified criteria for inclusion and exclusion. The most important piece for us was that for inclusion was it had to be peer reviewed. And then we look for patterns and themes in the review. So it's more like a qualitative content analysis as opposed to some sort of experiment here. And for each one, again, one of the issues that came up was time. We looked for 30 to 40 peer-reviewed articles in the end, and we developed a minimum of 20 structured abstracts. And a structured abstract is a particular way of abstracting a study that someone else can read it and not have to read the article to get a sense of what the conclusions were and all the key details of it. It's kind of like the executive summary of a report. Some people will only read the executive summary, so it needs to provide the highlights so that someone who doesn't read the entire summary will have everything that they need. So this is an example of what comes up in a structured abstract. The concept was studied by a researcher in the UK named James Hartley, who does a lot of work in design, document design research. And he found that people were better able to retain the information also. And so it made it easier for us to summarize. So if we didn't get to summarizing immediately, we could go to these structured abstracts and still be able to pull out the details that we were looking for. We also kept an Excel sheet with all the themes. But we have the research problem, the questions, a summary of the literature, not the themes covered, but literally the conclusions that are reported there, the methodology, reporting of the results, and the conclusions. Then ultimately, we wanted to create application materials, and we have worked on a couple of different formats. This is the format that we've been working with for the past year. It emerges at post usability test where things were a little bit long. We explain what it is. We talk about the benefits and challenges of this particular area of work, and then some specifics on how to use it. And notice at the end, we've got the discipline-specific advice. So if we were able to find advice in the research peer-reviewed literature about using this particular teaching technique in a particular discipline, we wanted to report it. It may not be a preponderance of evidence, but anything we feel like would be more credible than nothing. So before I move forward, are there any questions about what we were trying to accomplish with this study? Any questions about that? You can type yes, no, or if you want to pipe up and open your mic up, that's cool too. Okay, so we have a couple of all goods. I'm going to move forward. So I'll talk first about the needs assessment, because that's really, I mean, like any other good instructional design project, you should start out with what are the needs? Do people even need this? If the answer was no, then, so be it. We give the money back. So the purpose was to identify the actual challenges facing faculty so we could design a solution that addresses it. So the quantitative was a survey of what the greatest challenges were. We actually went a little bit in depth about what they were and what kinds of resources they used while teaching. And qualitative, where we had focus groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the methodology for that when I give the results of the focus group. The participants were, well, I take that back. I'm going to talk about the selection now. For the survey, we sent it to everybody in the institution, and we were very, very fortunate that we had people in the provost's office of both institutions that sent out the survey. So there was a certain blessing to the survey that we wouldn't have got had we done it through the department, trying to get to the administrator of every department and seeing if it could work. And so we had about a 10% response rate from both institutions to the survey. Not the best, but certainly not the worst. For the focus groups, however, we did a purposeful sample, and I literally went through every faculty listing and we counted every 7th instructor. So they were picked at random, just kind of like when I was a kid, we had dialing for dollars, and they always took the 7th name from the top. And we just did what we could do. Anyway, so what we did was we got these, and what was really nice about this is everybody we asked said yes. We had almost like of all the people we invited, I think maybe 1 or 2 people said no. So we had a really high acceptance rate, which to me was very, very, it was heartwarming because you never know if you're going to get people to show up for these, because we literally picked these people at random in the sense that they were picked just from a random selection of the samples. So here's who we had. We actually got a really nice mix of experience. It's presented in terms of the frequency, but we've got them ranging from the bulk of the instructors were in the middle range from 7 to over 26 years, but we had some in the earlier phases of their career, and this kind of matches the populations in both institutions. Second, their self-rated effectiveness. This goes back to that question we asked before. And what I thought was really interesting was how many, the majority are saying, it's like over 60% say that there are 4 or 5. My teaching is among the most effective in the institution. So people are pretty, I think it's kind of at least a little bit more heartwarming that they're giving themselves a 4, not all of them are giving them 5. But I do think it's kind of interesting that people tend to rate themselves highly. And what that means to me in practical terms is it's a little bit more challenging to try to work with somebody who thinks they're already good than to work with someone who knows that they need some improvement. And we also asked the same question in the focus groups, and we got very similar answers, which I thought was interesting. We asked them what materials they used in teaching. And notice the standard ones are pretty widely used. Readings, syllabi, slides by this point are pretty common. Video, interesting, Moodle. Moodle was not widely used. So that was actually an issue when we went a year later, when we went to all online teaching, remote teaching, because they actually had a large percentage of instructors had not even signed into Moodle. And it was 60% of this particular population. In my institution, I believe it was only about 50% had not signed into Moodle at all. And then podcasts were not widely used. Moodle is not a tool, absolutely right, David, but it's a way of getting materials out to people. And that's why, and also you can use it for the discussion board. So it's technically a tool, but it encompasses a lot of tools there. So a deeper dive. So the use of slides, how many use slides? This is really kind of interesting. The larger the class, the more likely they were to use slides. If they had less than 20, I was not a respondent here, because if I was a respondent, I would have brought the number of even below 20, I will use slides. But mostly when you have a really large class, people use slides. But when you just simply have a large class, it seems that most people are using slides. The major challenges, homework seems to be a major challenge for most instructors. Participation in class when you have a large class. Again, it's a huge issue for instructors. Completion of readings, this is kind of an interesting, we did some deeper dives and we looked at, okay, let's say does the number of years the instructor has have any impact on the extent of readings? And it seems to be that those at the highest end of the range, so the people with 20 or 6 or more years experience, although a few of them in the 7 to 15 years experience seem to have, fewer of them have, this is a major challenge. It's more of a minor challenge for them. But for many instructors at the earlier phase of their career, just simply getting students to read their stuff is a major challenge. Completion of readings. So people may start them, but not finish them. That's actually kind of interesting too. The larger the class, the more of an issue. The one place it doesn't seem to be a huge issue was in small classes. Other challenges that came up, the number one was, and it goes back, if you look at this, people are concerned about students not reading, and then you have unprepared students. And unprepared could really mean one of two things. Unprepared as in, I didn't do the reading or homework for today's class. But the other question is are they even prepared to be in the institution? Are they really even ready to be taking this course in the first place? Another issue that came up was student note-taking. It's not as huge of an issue. What was actually kind of interesting is that you hear a lot of controversy. There's an article from PBS in the States that makes its way over the internet every so often about note-taking versus on a computer versus by hand. But note-taking is not as, especially with a device, it's not as much of an issue as some of us would believe, which I thought was actually kind of interesting. And the difference in note-taking by institution, it's more of an issue at the CEGEP level, which makes sense. These are students are earlier in their academic, their post, their tertiary academic career. So that adjustment, and that's part of why the CEGEP system was developed, was to help facilitate that adjustment. Another issue had to do with assessment challenges. And the biggest challenges that arose were, number one, cheating. The largest percentage think of it as a major challenge, and there's a significant number of people think of it as a minor challenge. And alternatives to the standard, Scantron test, which is unfulfilling on a number of levels for a lot of other people. Not so much on writing fair multiple choice tests or fair essay tests. I mean, it's still a challenge, but it's not as huge of a challenge. And the appropriate numbers of, which is kind of interesting because the issue came up earlier, how much assessment, but is the appropriate number of assessments, that seems to be an issue, but it's not a huge one. And the appropriate types of assessment, people seem to get that, feel like basically they've got that down. Another thing that was actually kind of interesting, the non-challenges. So first one is PowerPoint, because I want to say, are people having issues with some of the technology? Nope, not really. Course management systems. Very few people think it's a major challenge. In fact, most people think it's not a challenge at all. The amount of detail in a syllabus. Clearly, none of these people read my syllabus, but for most people, that's not a challenge. And then response systems using things like clickers and stuff like that. That does not seem to be a huge challenge for people. So that's what came out of the survey. Any questions about the survey before we move on? Any questions about the survey before we move on to the other? All right, I'm going to move on to the focus groups.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, I might have missed it. Can you talk about the demographic of the people who were surveyed, like numbers, and did you get that information or no?
Yeah, we do. I don't have all of them off the top of my head. We have about, I think it's about 150 altogether completed the survey of a population of, I believe, maybe 12 to 1,400. Gender-wise, I think we were kind of representative. I don't have the details on discipline, but I do know whether it was representative or not, I don't know, but I do know that we had cross-disciplinary representation. And then in terms of experience, that one I did show, they were mostly in the middle of experience there. So somewhere between like 7 and 20. So at the university, that meant they were tenured, which means they're a lot more comfortable answering at up to like 25 years.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your questions for now.
Thank you.
Good. So we asked instructors, what do they like about teaching? We start off with that one because it's a nice way of kicking this off. And the first thing was the aha moment. A lot of people said that. Learning from students, and this is what I think is particularly relevant in light of the current circumstances in the world, human interaction. And this was a pre-pandemic response. So I think that's actually quite telling. So the greatest challenge is the lack of interest in the subject or the seeming lack of relevance to the students. Resources, and this would be time, money, teaching assistance, all that whole bag of assistance in creating the program. The student qualifications, the language issue that has come up in the chat, as well as subject matter preparation. And this is one, it was interesting, my David Price, who really pulled together all the results from this, he was characterized like this. I thought it was a really good way of putting it. Students want knowledge transfer so they can demonstrate it during the assessment, which is a really polite way of saying, I want to get an A on the test, and what do I have to do to get it? And in fact, that came out in the focus groups. People actually, it's like fingernails on chalkboard to a lot of us instructors. But there is that mentality among some students, a large number of them. Some other challenges. The lack of preparation behind the scenes, including several people said the lack of orientation for instructors. I mean, you're thrown into the classroom. A lot of very grade focused students. In other words, what's my grade? Large classes, that's a huge issue in our institutions. We've got some funding challenges in Quebec. And then finally, evaluations of instruction, mostly the student evaluations of teaching. And I think probably the most polite thing I can say is that nobody is too thrilled with them. We also asked instructors, okay, so if you're going to go for advice, where are you going to go to advice? Well, the number one was their colleague. I'm going to go to another instructor. Next one is faculty development group. So that would be most of the people in this room, although not all of you, because I know we have at least one instructor in this room. And then finally going online for advice. And part of our thought was, well, I was glad to see that. I'd see that we're not number one, but we're hoping we can come up with a resource that we would be like at least a higher number 3 than instead of just basic number 3. What recognition do instructors want for any faculty development efforts? It's really interesting. So what if we were to get, and the question was asked, what if we were to give you like a badge? And one person just had a violent, really violent reaction. It was only one person, but it was so violently negative that it just sticks with me. They felt like, I do all this work to get a PhD, to get publications, all this, and now you want to make me get like a credential on top of it? That's horrible. How can you do that to me? So it was really kind of interesting. Others were actually quite fine. It's like, yeah, I'd like some recognition. I might give me an incentive to actually be more active in participating. So I think, it goes all over the place. So the one conclusion that we kind of came out of this as we were looking for all of this, one of the things that it was more of an observation that was not from the data itself, but it was from interpreting the data. When people teach in the K-12 system, and I work in an education department where 2 of our largest programs are teacher prep programs, the teaching expertise is what you get your license for. And literally, you have to demonstrate that expertise just to get your license. But it's interesting, you probably have heard, they don't know how to teach math, but they're teaching it anyway. Because your subject matter expertise has no bearing on what your actual placement is. I had when he was my student, I had a teacher who specialized in middle school. A few years later, he's vice principal of an adult ed center. No prep in adult ed. So we just move people around based on their educational experience. Every other level of education, college, university, teaching, continuing ed, and training, you are hired for your expertise in the subject matter, and it is assumed that you will develop the teaching skill, which I find interesting. Just as an aside, I've done other research on perceptions of training professionals. That's my original background. And what the research was pretty clear. People need both, but subject matter expertise, at least for trainers, I would say it's a 51-49 difference. So it's not a huge difference, but they would rather, that credibility is really important. If you don't know your subject, it's hard to maintain. And so I'd say in university, as one of my colleagues said, you're hired for expertise, and that really is relevant. So some conclusions from this, most instructors think they're pretty good. And when they want advice, it kind of needs to be given on the down low. But make no mistake, instructors need guidance. Online resources could be a source if they were easy to access and use. The guidance should be evidence-based, but also discipline-based. And finally, although our focus was the current instructor, significant opportunity exists in onboarding instructors. So the result, one of the things that came out of this, it kind of affirmed that there's a potential for our system. I wouldn't say it was the web evidence said, oh my God, we've just been waiting for this all our lives. But there is definitely opportunity for this. And it helped us guide some topics that where people were really having challenges. One is assessment, objective assessment, which would be multiple choice, essay, and then alternative assessment. Class discussions, how to manage those, group assignments, both group projects where students are graded and just simply group work where people are working in groups but not necessarily graded for it. Homework, getting people to do it. Interactivity in class, this is over and above the class discussions piece. Note taking, although it's not a huge issue, we had the bandwidth to do it, so we looked into it. Preventing plagiarism, and probably one of the most challenging topics, and we looked at it from a number of different perspectives, was what we call transnational students, and I'll explain what we mean by that term later. But there were 3 particular aspects of this. The prior knowledge of these students who are coming educated outside the country, their educational backgrounds, and their challenges that they face on campus. And we ended up making a slight change to our approach. Originally, we were going to develop a separate system. We're going to actually be, we're partnering with Saltese, which is a community of practice here in Quebec. And our resources will be posted there. We're going to have case studies. We'll have these summaries that are written. And then on a separate site, we will also have available the structured abstracts so people can look at them. And we are also going to be we have developed already, we just haven't launched it yet because I want to do it at the beginning of an academic year. We want to launch an ongoing series of like monthly messages that kind of direct people to different pieces of our resources so that people can be constantly reminded of it and will think about using them the next time they have a question. So are there any questions before we proceed? Any questions? Okay, then let's continue. So the first one is, I'm going to just give you summaries of the kinds of research that we did about for evidence-based guidance. And the first was what you should know when your students come from all over the world. And one of the things that was really important was to distinguish between international students, which has a very discrete definition, and that is people who pay international tuition rates to study at Canadian colleges and universities. And so even though and that's not the sum total of all the students who have backgrounds outside of Canada that come to our classrooms. And so we're using the word transnational students because there are people who receive their earlier education outside of Canada, and they're either currently permanent residents or citizens, and they've enrolled in a program of study, but they still did their prior preparation outside. So the same issues to some extent, especially in terms of the classroom, exist because they were educated elsewhere. In fact, our program is the first stop for many immigrants, which we're very excited about and proud of. But we also want to be assessed, we want to be sensitive to their needs to make sure that they achieve their educational goals out of what we're trying to do with them. So these were the keywords that we used when we were doing the look for this. And what we were particularly focused for in one of these, in the survey I'm going to talk about now, or the integrative lit review, was just simply what was the preparation? In other words, our students come from different parts of the world. What did they learn? So it was not, it's not research in the most traditional sense. It's more of a survey kind of material that we're looking for. So we were limited to English language publications by the limits of our, we could have used French language, to be honest. Nadine Bacouche, who did most of this research, is fully bilingual in both languages. But the French language material wasn't available for most of these regions. We wanted information on target regions to provide insights into their experience. And then we used some also research judgment. So we made some calls on some of these. And believe it or not, spelling and formatting errors, if there was a report that was just so full of typos, we felt like we probably couldn't trust, even if they couldn't get the language right, there's a chance they also weren't getting the data right. So we didn't want to trust it. So international versus domestic. Yeah, exactly, Jennifer. That's what we were trying. That was the point we were trying to make. International versus domestic is a really insufficient. So the big question for us is, where did they get the preparation? So we also wanted to look at what was going on in primary, secondary, and higher ed, and any internationalization that was going on in those other systems. Are there agreements in place? Because those agreements can have some control over what's included in the curriculum and some processes that go on. So general education in the world, Canada receives them from a number of places. It turns out we've done some research. These are the main areas. I should say Canada, it's really Concordia gets most of its students from China, India, Middle East and North Africa, and Latin America. So these were the 4 regions that we looked at because this is what's most important to the population that we were working with. There are other parts of the country, they get students from other places, but this is what is the largest part of our prior preparation. And the diversity of educational background can make designing classes a challenge. By the way, there's a benefit when you get in the class because you have all this diversity of experience and really cool stories from lots of different places. So what do they have in common? The systems have in common, they're trying to balance the goals of quality and access. So they're trying to make education available to more people and to make it good. There's increasing prevalence of large-scale cultural reforms. Canada is not the only one that's trying to go through educational reform. It seems to be going on everywhere. In some areas, and we'll talk about this in a moment, there is some level of curricular convergence. That is, doesn't matter where in the world you go, in certain subject areas, there's a certain convergence about what they're teaching. But there are regional inequalities, and there isn't convergence in every subject area. So in terms of students for China, where they probably had some of the most absolutely significant reforms over the past 50 years, they have some high quality educational backgrounds there. There's a big emphasis in those universities on 21st century skills and on cultivating discipline and perseverance in their studies. It is an extremely competitive system. They have exams, really high stakes exams that students take, and that determines their placement in higher ed. There are traditional approaches to teaching many subjects, especially in the humanities and the social sciences. And it's a very teacher-focused approach to teaching for the most part. That said, there is a great emphasis in trying to reshift the teaching onto student focused. But like in most systems, it's easier said than done. And there are likely some discomfort with some types of political materials. In terms of students from India, there seems to be of all the regions, this one, the Indian subcontinent seemed to have the widest variability because each state in India is implementing its reforms in its own way. And so you've got real different equality. Different states have different resources, and they also invest they have different values. And as a result, there's real difference between them. The challenges is some of them in terms of relating the implementation of the reforms. Some districts really do it, some schools really do it, others really don't. And they've got a pretty large set of private institutions, which also affects things because it takes resources from the public system. There is a problem of outdated curricula, partly because there's a lack of resources to update the curriculum. There's a shortage of qualified teachers, and there's some political interference in the school system. Although we say it here, it's really true for everyone. We're trying to give some general characteristics, but please don't confuse that for generalizing about all students. Every student is a unique individual, and what we can do is get a macro understanding of the circumstances in which they studied, but that does not tell us who they are as individuals. Students from the Middle East and North Africa, it's a large region and it's highly politicized. There is definitely educational reform going on throughout that region, but there's a tension going on between the tradition and modern. There's close links with education institutions in France and the USA. And so there's parts of the curriculum are really similar to Western countries, but there's a different emphasis. So with critical thinking, students may gravitate towards subjects that do not require polemic engagement. With religious and moral education, there's just a very different value hierarchy, and the courses are very different than the ones we teach here. It doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. It just means one's what's taught there, one's what's taught here. And they do teach the Western canon, but they do it with a local flavor. And so some of the emphases obviously will be different because it's being taught from a different cultural point of view. In terms of Latin America, it's a large region and there's tons of social inequality there. A basic education is sometimes designed to accommodate working children. So in other words, the basic K-12 system, they know their kids are working, and so they're designed for working kids, just like we have programs for mature adults who we know are working at the university level. There is a history of reform. So in other words, before they finish one reform, the next one's in place, and their trade agreements have been put in place that have created some closer links with foreign educational providers. In fact, there are some European and American universities that operate at a distance inside South America and Latin America. And there's a high degree of variation in the academic preparedness between students based on their access to good education. Some general similarities: everyone's got education reform, and the content of science and math seems to be more consistent across all of the different systems than when we get to some of the differences, where first of all, we see education reform having different levels of success in different places within countries, and then within different countries within regions. The consistency of education within countries may or may not be the same. So a student that comes out of, let's say, Tunisia, student comes from one part of the country, they're going to have a different experience than the other. And the contents of humanities and some social science courses will be really different. They teach, the local history and culture. So what does this mean for instructors? Cultivate awareness of the variability in your students' backgrounds. Social and regional inequality will exist, so their preparation is going to be different. There are also individual factors from them, their family background, what's the extent of their experience abroad versus here, and do they have access to qualified teachers both there and maybe for tutors for here. In some ways, the large scale reforms are bringing us closer together. Students are prepared, but it's not completely identical. So one of the things instructors probably need to do is begin by just finding out where are your students and designing the course to take them from where they are to as close as where they want to get them. But don't assume that they're at a particular place, but move forward based on where they really are. So you'll need to assess that. So here are the works cited. Does anybody have any questions about this? Anybody have any questions about this before I move on?
Yes, I do have one.
Please.
What's the expectation for the instructor when you say cultivate awareness? So do you expect professors to kind of adapt their curriculum to every student?
I think one of the things, well, that's hard. And the larger the class, the less likely it is, unless it's online. If it were online, the advice I would give is do a pre-test to get a sense of what people have, and then you could place them in maybe some preparatory modules before you move them forward. For a face-to-face class, I would still do the pre-test, but what you might find out is, as I led a course development workshop many years ago, and I think it was a really good example. The instructor was very upset because students just never seemed to get where he wanted them to go, and he just assumed they were stupid. And I said, what's their entering knowledge? And he spent some time getting a sense of what that was. And he said, the problem was mine. I assumed they started high and they were actually much lower. And so I just end up saying, I'm not taking that far because that was never realistic. So develop a more realistic expectation about where they are. And it may require a conversation with your colleagues if your course is a prereq course. In other cases, you may want to let students know in advance what they should be able to do. So in other words, the competencies they should be walking in with. So if they don't have them, they give them a tool to figure that out. Let them there. The other thing too is that's only piece of it. Jennifer is saying, I think it's important not to position international students deficient. The other thing too is don't assume it's just your non-Canadian students. Your Canadian students may not have the prep either. I've so often seen students walk into class who do not have the prep that they need. So I think just coming in with the idea, I'm just going to assess everybody, and you don't want to single out because that's discriminatory, but also it's also denying the Canadian students who may not be prepped properly the opportunity of finding out what they need. So you may want to reassess where you are. So that to me would be the big gross outcome of this particular thing. I think the other thing too is there are going to be cultural references in class. And when your students are international, or have a largely international background, some very specific, very local references may not be meaningful to them because it's just not part of their experience. It doesn't mean you don't use it. It just means you share what that reference means, because that's a way of helping them get to know the culture here too. So it's just making fewer assumptions. It's just really saying, I'm going to be the guide to help them. I want to figure out where they are so I can help them get where they go. And I'm also not going to assume that even my cultural references are understood. And I'll serve as someone who shares, an ambassador, so to speak. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to move forward in the interest of time. So the next one we looked at was plagiarism. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to get right into it. We call it academic integrity in my institution and a lot of institutions. And this is our statement on academic integrity. This is our definition of it. But it usually takes the form of plagiarism. And it's a real concern for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's scary when students do it, and it's a lot of work. And so this is the definition that we use for plagiarism. And it refers to truth, theft, and misappropriation, intellectual property. And so why do students plagiarize? So that was one of the real, for me, David Jones is the student who worked on this one on the RA, and it's just fascinating to me. They're doing poorly. There's a laziness or a rushness to it. And I've seen as recently, student did something, they were in a rush and they made a really bad choice and they copied, and it had some awful consequences. When people are anxious, they do less than smart things. And sometimes belief in the content on the internet is fair game. And if their prior education has taught them that, and by the way, it's not just from where they are. If they've done it and haven't gotten called out for it, that's as much, so they could be from here. If they've been copying and nobody's been saying anything, as far as they're concerned, that's legit behavior. There are contextual reasons, peer pressure, neglected perceived consequences, because a lot of plagiarism just goes completely ignored. Students think we don't care, and well, everybody else is doing it, so why can't I? So what, hold on, I went the wrong direction. So there are 4 challenges. One is the information age. The ability to copy and reuse other people's material, it just gets exponentially easier by the day, except with the chat. We've turned off chat on copying from Concordia in the Zoom rooms, but I think that's one of the only ones I've ever seen turned off. Mass education is one thing. The increase of online academic resources, and what we really mean is services that will write papers for you, or where you can just simply get your own. Some people like to have custom written because that's a little bit harder to detect. Other people use third-party things. And then the cost versus effectiveness. So how do you address it? One suggestion is to embrace it. Recognize it's going to happen and figure out what can we do. And a lot of the advice is like, try not to be as punitive as we have been, because it has really negative consequences. Take it seriously, but often, but don't, maybe be a little bit nicer. So that's where you get these words like embrace, avoid, and deter. And sometimes just simply telling people what plagiarism is, believe it or not, spending some quality time on it really makes a difference. I redid a course for undergraduates recently where I have a whole lesson on plagiarism, and it's amazing, by including that, the amount of plagiarism that we detected in that course after the revision was significantly lower than we experienced before the revision. So it makes a difference. There's some specific guidance within disciplines. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read these, but I'll give you a second to read these yourself. And I just want to really, I just want to share one application. Unfortunately, we're running low on time, but, and that is, like I said, there was an application that's coming out, and I'll be happy to talk your ears off after the session about the group work stuff. But we are launching now a new program at Concordia called C-Teach. It's a graduate certificate in teaching in higher and continuing education, and its purpose is to prepare and develop instructors for college, university, and continuing ed assignments, both full and part-time. So it's targeted at anyone who holds a master's degree or higher, or is earning one of those. So our current graduate students are one population, but current instructors who want to strengthen their teaching skills, definitely welcome to them, and they're definitely in mind, and professionals who want to get into the teaching business. And some really cool things about the program, if I say so myself, we do some pathing based on discipline. So even with courses, we recognize that there are different disciplinary approaches, and we try to address that. We take a blended learning approach, so you can take the whole thing online, and it's designed for people who are doing other things. So it's kind of treated, although we're taking teaching seriously, we're trying to do it as a second priority for people who are primarily consider themselves researchers or professionals in another field, which is how many of us are many faculty are looked at. So how does the program work? Well, it's 2-part together. It's a graduate certificate, but it starts off with a micro-credential with 3 courses. One is learning theories for higher and continuing ed. And we'll talk about things like, making sure that your class is welcoming to all students, and how students learn, because a lot of people don't understand how people learn. A whole course on course design, where we will actually workshop, and people from different disciplines will give their feedback, because I think that cross-disciplinary perspective will be useful. And the same thing with facilitation, where people will actually have the opportunity. Experienced instructors, this micro-credential may be all that they need, but people are trying to break into it, may want an internship. So the student ultimately has to find it, but we will facilitate the process of finding a teaching assignment. And they teach a term-long course, and we have something of similar scope in Cont Ed. And then they have, while they're teaching the course, we have a reflection assignment where they also develop their teaching portfolio, which I might say we also emphasize in the earlier courses. And that is C-Teach. So do you have any questions about any of this? And if you want the slides, they are posted with the session. So anybody have any questions, concerns, thoughts? I see that Nick's comment made a huge impact on people. And thanks for the comment, Nick, about the new program. We're really excited about it.
Yeah, it's a great idea, and I hope that people take an interest. Like I said, we are not required to get any additional training, and so quite frankly, teachers who give training never get any, and I don't know if that's going to change.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's, well, it's really interesting when you mention that. In the UK, and believe it or not, in Peru, if you teach at the tertiary level, you have to have some kind of teaching credential. My partner is originally from Peru. He was an economics professor down there. And he actually got a bachelor in education that he got after he had all his other credentials and was working precisely because they required it. And then I understand that in the UK, they also have that. Yeah, I agree, Jennifer. I wish teaching were required. I wish these kinds of things of participating in something like this would be looked upon favorably. I also think it's important, you know, they just throw you into teaching and there's all kinds of things. And I've seen teachers make some really, really not wise choices that I think they would make different choices if they'd had some onboarding to this process.
May I ask if
You may ask. Yes.
if the instructional skills workshop has much uptake, and your take on that in Quebec?
When you say the instructional skills workshop, can you be a little bit more specific?
The ISW, as it's known, is a grassroots situated, really intense,
Oh, yeah.
non-specialist workshop of teaching.
I can't speak for all of Quebec. I can speak for Concordia and some of the CEGEPs. Not as much as you might wish. At Concordia, I actually taught that workshop. It was developed out of McGill, and we brought it to Concordia. I taught it for a few years, and it kind of died. I'd stopped teaching it. They offered for a few more years. It died. They tried bringing it back, and mixed response to that. We have what's been a little bit more successful is we have a workshop for graduate students, an introduction to teaching workshop that used to be a prereq for the earlier version of this program. It's no longer is. Don't make that assignment. But yeah, it's not really that great.
Interesting. I'm dialing in from BC, and there's a lot of uptake of it here, and it's a 3-day very intensive collegial, and your colleagues are your students in your group, and so a lot of empathy building. It's not a perfect model by any stretch, but that's sort of one of the few go-tos I'm aware of. At least,
You know, it sounds really awful, but I think the fact that yours is 3 days and not the 5 days, I think actually is a huge, I mean,
there's the rest of it is an online, it's a blended model, so
Yeah.
it's 3 days face-to-face and the remainder. Anyhow, it's just
no, it's really, I think that's really cool. I'd love to stay here and talk, but it's 2 o'clock. So I'm going to stick around for a couple of minutes. I'm going to stop recording. I want to thank everybody for being here